If we look at gross negligent manslaughter being applied to governments where maternity services are failing, these failings result in preventable deaths to mothers and babies. I also add nurses and midwives who are suicidal, have a hard time with their employment, with their regulator, with civil and criminal actions. Now, the contrast would be, just for example, there was a football stadium catastrophe 30 plus years ago called Hillsborough near Liverpool in the UK, and about almost 100 people, 96 people died. 30 years later, they had an inquiry, and this investigation said there's nobody liable under gross negligent manslaughter. And there clearly was errors made, even accepted errors made by those organising it, in particular the police. They had closed certain areas and the stampede, and people got trampled because of the actions. But for the actions of the police, those people would have lived. And it's the same thing with clinical medical negligence, but for the actions or omissions of a clinician. And sometimes it's the management. They make decisions like closing a birth centre or suspending a home birth team. And then a woman's giving birth at home, she calls for help, she cannot get the help, there's no skilled birth practitioner. If she has a breech birth, there's no skilled breech birth practitioner present, and this results in preventable deaths. We have many reports, particularly in the UK. All countries will have preventable deaths, just as there are preventable deaths driving cars. Now, a simple thing to reduce deaths in cars was a law to enforce seatbelts. Some countries don't wear seatbelts and they have higher deaths as a result. Another simple law was to put lights on the car during daytime. And for example, that's quite normal in Europe and not in the UK. And this also results in reducing preventable deaths. So when we look at maternity care, there can be some simple measures like providing home birth, providing birth centres. Now we're having an increase in unassisted births because of lack of choices for women, because they don't want the coercion, the trauma that happens on a daily basis in many hospitals, if not most hospitals, globally, everywhere. So looking at the principle of gross negligent manslaughter being applied fairly, it appears that if a midwife attends a birth or arrives even after a birth and there has been a death of a baby, for example, they are charged sometimes with gross negligent manslaughter. And the state is not charged when there's hundreds or thousands of births. So there's a great inequity there. What it's about is a lack of action by society, by the public, by people. The families themselves are usually so traumatised. Even there's secondary trauma for those witnessing primary trauma, just as with Hillsborough, the police who caused the problem, in some respects, the management of police, the other police attending the event, dealing with death and injury on a large scale, were traumatised, that secondary trauma. They successfully took action in a case called R.V. White against the Chief Constable of Merseyside. I think it's R.V. White. Anyway, there was a case against Chief Constable of Merseyside. They were successful. Now, in theory, midwives could apply the same law. It's psychiatric injury, and you have to be close enough to the event to be a participant. So, for example, a midwife attending a birth, somebody does something traumatic like the forceps of a baby or cesarean, or in the case of the breech baby where the doctor was trying to pull the baby out, mother was only 4 centimetres open, and trigger warning here, and I really mean it, there is a trigger warning. If you don't want to hear it, switch off for 20 seconds. The baby was decapitated by the doctor, and then another doctor did a cesarean to recover the head and reunite it with the body of the dead baby. That was in the UK. There was no question about gross negligent manslaughter, and yet a midwife in the UK arriving at a house where there's been a birth and the baby's born dead has been charged with gross negligent manslaughter. For me, that raises a question about even deep psychological archetypes. Is the midwife seen as a witch and the doctor seen as God? Godlike figures can do no wrong, so when they do something wrong, they're excused. And generally the female population of midwifery is very much about love, and there can be an inherent fear of love, fear of goodness, and there's safety and control and this kind of management in maternity services. So I'm just raising these questions because the actions that would be required would be for individuals when they've been abused at traumatic births to take actions, criminal and civil actions, and take actions against the police if they fail to take those actions in every country. And those actions are assault, battery, trespass to the person, medical negligence, negligence causing such harm or death that it becomes gross negligent manslaughter. And if death didn't occur but almost or could have, then it's attempted gross negligent manslaughter. Those actions can be taken by families and others if they're an interested party and allowed by the court to take the case. So a human rights group, for example, may take an action, or a consumer group of some type. Other actions can be taken against employers or against maternity hospitals, where they're perpetuating violence, often on a daily basis, as I mentioned, and no actions are generally taken. So it would be interesting testing the law on this to have an action. I have an action against the UK government for failing to provide midwifery, failing to provide home birth, failing to respect the right to private life of women giving birth, of families wishing to choose how they would like to birth and where they would like to birth. In addition, the right to private and family life extends to midwives and others. So midwives have a right to work, they have a right to provide midwifery care. When the state imposes or adopts European legislation about indemnity insurance, if there's none available, it's not practical, it's not affordable, it's not achievable, then it's just being used as a barrier, and that breaches the right to private and family life. The additional breaches are cruel and inhumane treatment, as in its degrading treatment for women quite often, and for the midwives. And there's no fair process, and it's a form of discrimination. So there's a variety of human rights breaches. There are civil breaches and possibly criminal, I think very likely criminal. And it's strange that the police are very happy to prosecute somebody not paying a bus ticket that costs £1 or £2 or euros, and yet they won't prosecute hospitals where babies are dying unnecessarily, mothers are traumatised, and sometimes there's also maternal deaths which are preventable. And in one case in London, a senior doctor simply wrote to the coroner saying, "This is tragic death, but it is kind of understandable from a medical condition." And it wasn't. There was a great deal of negligence. And only when the coroner's decision was challenged in the High Court was there a proper investigation. So I encourage people always to take actions and maybe follow this action in the UK and think about what's happening in your country. What are the statistics? Most of the data collection is not accurate, it's not honest, or it just isn't happening. But there are preventable deaths of mothers and babies in every country. So let's find out more about it and see what actions can be taken.